So today we're going to finish talking about the distinctions between explicit memory and explicit memory, and some of the nuances in between those as well. Your book brings up this very interesting point about there being this proposed difference between knowing and remembering. And so we often use these words pretty interchangeably in our day-to-day conversation, but research actually suggests that there are some important differences between these two words, and also differences between the associated cognitive processes that underlie them as well. And so cognitive researcher Endel Tolving, you'll probably remember Tolving from some of the other memory-based studies that we've talked about. He proposed that there's this theoretical, this sort of hypothetical continuum of sorts within our implicit memory, within our procedural memory. And so with his idea here, this continuum, there are kind of these three different areas along this continuum. So one of the areas is called anoetic. And so this means having a lack of knowing, a complete absence of knowing, right? And so we see this kind of memory in procedural memory, right? Where you're like, I don't know how to explicitly or consciously sort of tell you how I know how to ride a bike or everything that goes into driving a car. I know it, I do it, it could be 20 years since I've ridden a bike, and I can still do the basics of it. And then from there, we have this noetic, this feeling or this sense of knowing. This is often what underlies our recognition of something. Oh yeah, I remember, I've heard about that band, or oh yeah, that's right. I remember she said that that party was coming up a couple of weeks from now. And then third, we have autonoetic. So this is this actual fully fledged sort of comprehensive recall of information. And so this is more akin to what we see in episodic memory, right? We're able to consciously recall information, right? Instead of the more unconscious or subconscious processes that go on with procedural memory. With our episodic memory, right? We're able to declare, we're able to consciously bring up that information. And not only that, but we are able to bring up the instances in which surrounding our knowledge of that episodic information. So this is not only remembering information that you've studied for an exam, right? But you might even be able to remember, where in the book you might have seen that. You might even remember, oh yeah, there was some kind of diagram with a brain, and there are like labels, and like one of them was purple, and one of them was green. You have a lot more of the contextual information surrounding your recall of that, rather than just this more sort of general sense of knowing that's proposed to come along with our semantic memory. So again, well, I don't know how I know what the capital of Italy is. I don't know when I learned that. I don't know any of the context behind me first learning that fact, right? But you still know it. And so Tolving not only, didn't just pull this out of thin air. This is something that he had, this was an idea, this continuum that was generated from some of the experiments that he had done. And so he had noticed there were these distinctions in how participants talked about their memory for something. They talked about knowing and remembering in different ways. And so again, going back to this definition let's go back to the last slide, the difference between this noetic and this autonoetic. A better way, a less clunky and technical way of thinking of that is rather than saying noetic, just saying knowing, right? Of this sense of, oh, I know that information, versus autonoetic of really remembering, really being able to really richly recall the details around something. And so we'll be using knowing and remembering in the rest of this lecture rather than those more technical terms, just because I think it's a more helpful way of talking about these. And your book also too just briefly mentions those words and then keeps going. So we are going to use the words that are more applicable in real life. What Tolley found in his experiments was that participants, when they talked about remembering something, they talked about it in a way that they were able to clearly, consciously recall information with also the associated details of when or where they learned it. In contrast, this knowing was more of this sort of recognition of, oh yeah, that's familiar, but I don't know where or when I learned that. And what Tolving found was that in his experiments, when his participants were asked to freely or spontaneously recall information, so for example, like this would be similar to a short answer problem on a test, right? Where you're just given a prompt, where you're just said, okay, tell me everything that you know about this. So when they were having to freely recall information, they were more likely to report this feeling of knowing, right? They had this really clear idea of, oh yeah, you know, I remember where I learned that. Again, going to our test example, right? For those of you who might be really visual, this is something that would happen to me and still happens to me on short answer tests. You know, I would write things out on like a whiteboard, and when I would go to write my short answers, I was like, oh yeah, I remember, you know, kind of the context of this, right? I could remember the ink that I, you know, was writing it in and practicing my answers or drawing things out. I could really bring that up in my mind's eye, and I could really provide the details of that information. Whereas having sort of cues for recall or hints for our recall, it tended to leave Tolving's participants with sort of this sense of knowing. And so again, going back to our test, I think tests neatly exemplify this, because we have short answers, but then we also have multiple choice, right? And on multiple choice tests, it's giving you sort of a little bit of a cue, right? Sometimes there are hints within the question itself, and so it's more the case that you're having to recognize the information, right? Normally what happens when you're taking a multiple choice test is that you look through the answers, and you know, maybe one or two of them jumps out at you, you know, and so at that point, then you're relying more on that sense of knowing of, oh yeah, I know that C is the correct answer. You might not be able to pull up all of the reasoning for why that's the case, right? You might not remember where in your notes, you know, you learned that information, right? Or like, oh yeah, I remember that was the day that I learned this information, and then after that, like I went to the ice cream with my roommate, like, right? Like, unless you have one of those like top 1%, you know, crazy specific memories, you're not going to remember all of the details surrounding that, but rather with multiple choice, you're gonna be like, oh, well, I know it's C. I know that that's the right answer. And so, interestingly enough, from Tolving's research, we not only saw sort of this reported distinction from participants about knowing and remembering, but we also saw it in connection with their performances as well. And so, research then shows that it actually it takes less certainty to have the feeling of knowing in comparison to remembering. So again, on a multiple choice test, you might be really certain, right? Of like, yeah, it's definitely C. But again, you're like, well, I feel like this is the right answer. That's what I'm gonna go with. Whereas when you're writing the short essay answer questions, you are like giving it all you've got, but you're like, I don't know, like, was that right? Like, did I remember that right concept with that right person, right? Like, was Pavlov the one with the dogs, and then there's like the bell and the food and like the classical conditioning, like, was that right? And then also there's this feeling of familiarity that comes with just simply knowing information. It actually lasts longer. So this sense of knowing lasts longer than our experience of remembering something. That seems to be more shorter. That seems to be shorter in duration. And so that's the lab. Let's talk about sort of more real life examples. So first of all, we'll start with the tip of the tongue phenomenon, right? We've talked about this before, and this is something that we've all experienced. And so when you're having that tip of the tongue moment, when you're trying to think of somebody's name or a word or the name of the coffee shop that you've been wanting to go to, you have this sense that the information that you're after is kind of within reach, so to speak, metaphorically. So oftentimes you can see the object that you're trying to name in your mind's eye. You even might be able to describe it, right, with some detail. You might be like, oh, okay, so it's like, it's metal, it's like a cylinder, it has a handle, you like use it to like water plants. And then you're like, oh, watering can, that's it, that's what it's called. And so the tip of the tongue phenomenon shows us kind of this nice example of Tolving's proposed continuum of going from knowing to remembering. So when we eventually have that aha moment of like, oh, watering can, that's what it was. We go from this sense of knowing that well, I know I've learned the information, I know it's there, to actually being able to remember it clearly and being able to retrieve it from our memories. And so a fun example of this is Andy, the character Andy from the show The Office. If you've never seen this show, there's a really famous sort of bit for the character of Andy in one of the episodes where he has the Kit Kat theme song stuck in his head, and he can't remember the last part of it. He can't remember that it's the Kit Kat theme song, right? He just knows, I've got this like jingle stuck in my head, and he's trying to figure out the ending of it. He keeps singing it over and over to himself, trying to get the ending. So here's a compilation of him trying to get that ending correct. Let me go ahead and do a new share. Okay. All right, so here is Andy trying desperately to remember the ending of this jingle.
1, 2, a 1, 2.
Oh, and also this is somebody's interposing the actual Kit Kat commercial, and then Andy trying to remember it.
Oh, give me a break, give me a break, take me off a piece of that.
I am totally blanking. What is the thing?
Nobody tell him.
What? No, why?
You got it. You're so close.
Take me off a piece of that.
Bread, applesauce, piece of that Chrysler car.
Nope.
Football cream.
Okay. It's football cream. It's football cream.
Give me a break, give me a break, take me off a piece of that.
Claude Van Damme. Hair for men. Poison gas. Nutra sweet. It's got to rhyme with peace. Fancy feast.
Take me off a piece of that.
Fancy feast. It's a cat food. Nailed it.
And so sometimes, as Andy shows us, sometimes our tip of the tongue experience, we're able to correctly recall the information, and other times we're not. So sometimes we think that the jingle that's stuck on our head is for cat food when it's really for a piece of candy. Okay, so let's move on. We're going to talk about some case studies in which we also have some additional evidence for this idea of having this distinction between knowing and remembering. And so Schachter in 1996 wrote about a 65-year-old man, referred to his initials as BG, who had suffered a stroke in his right frontal lobe. And so although there were other aspects of his memory that were totally normal, he did have this notable pattern of false recognition. And so saying that he remembered something, having seen something previously when that wasn't actually the case. And experimenters, they found this pattern when they were giving him a list learning task. Again, classic cognitive psychology experiment, right? So BG was given a list of words. They were presumed to be familiar to him. You know, they weren't anything totally obscure and random. And then, so he was supposed to study this list of words, and then later he was just supposed to say yes or no regarding his recognition. So, was this word that you see in front of you on the list before, yes or no? And in addition to this, they also asked him to say whether he felt that he remembered the word or if he just knew it. And so, again, this is the idea here that remembering is going to be different than knowing. And so BG was told, you know, say that you remember having encountered a word on the list when you have a specific recollection of something that you thought of when you studied the word. So you looked at the word, you saw that it was flower, and you know, maybe you noticed within yourself, right, that you thought of daisies, or you thought of your grandma's garden, or something like that. And then in contrast, he was asked to say that he knew the word when it seemed familiar, but he wasn't able to recall anything specific related to it. So, you know, he saw the word ocean, for example, but, you know, maybe there wasn't anything that came to mind when he saw that word, right? And so even though his memory for the words it seemed to be relatively normal in terms of his correct recall for words, he made a lot of errors. So he made what are called false alarms. So this means that he said, yes, I've seen that word before, when he actually hadn't. And also, interestingly enough, again, there's this pattern of remembering way more than sort of we would normally expect, because they had control groups do the same study, and they found that 40% of the time, BG was saying, oh, I remember that word. You know, that word was on the list and I remember it. I had specific details that came up with it when I was studying the list. Versus controls, that only happened 5% of the time for controls. So we can see here this pattern or this bias towards remembering. And so the experimenters, they went on to talk about, you know, maybe some explanation for maybe why this was going on. Perhaps, you know, the words that he was claiming to remember were really semantically similar to words on the word list. That is, their meanings were similar, or conceptually they were similar, right? So maybe he saw the word rose on the list, and it was kind of connected to his recollection of flower, and he started thinking about his grandma's garden, and maybe his grandma really loved roses, and so he saw roses, or he saw the word rose, and he was like, oh yes, I remember seeing that word. And that was maybe what was driving his incorrect remembrances. Researchers also talked about, well, maybe he was influenced by his word knowledge just before the experiment. Maybe there are already pre-existing connections in his mind that made him more likely to say that he remembered, or to sort of interfere with his memory process in that way. And so to try to control for these possible confounds, they then did another study, and they had him learn these pseudo words or non-words. So these are words that don't actually exist, like brap or space, to try to see if it was really familiarity with the words that were driving this. And they found that in these follow-up studies, he still demonstrated this similar pattern of saying that he remembered words more frequently, and remembered words that weren't actually on the list. And so, again, they were able to then control for possibly just, the connections that he had to words or between words before starting the experiment. And just to give you a sense of what a right frontal stroke looks like, so this is an MRI of somebody who has had a right frontal stroke. And something you'll always want to keep in mind when you're looking at images is that what is on the left-hand side is actually the right side of the body, and what's on the right-hand side is actually on the left side of the body. So essentially, you can think of this as the image you are looking up into the brain from the chin, essentially. I know it's a little confusing, but this is an example of somebody who has had a right-sided stroke, and so hopefully my mouse is showing up. Ooh, maybe I'll use the spotlight. What does that do? Oh, it's asking me for permissions. Okay, well, you know what? I'll play around with that later. Anyway, hopefully you can see my mouse on the screen. And so this darker gray area here, that shows the damage from a stroke. And so then we're going to move on from BG, and we're going to talk about another case study. And so there's a case of a man who his the researchers of him called him by JB, his initials. And so he had he had an aneurysm in his left frontal lobe. So BG had the damage in his right, and JB had it in his left. So again, here's just an example, just so you can sort of get a sense of the different parts of the brain that are connected with this. And so again, here, when we look at images, we want to remember that right is on the left and left is on the right. And so here we can see that this is a pretty big aneurysm. Again, let me try to annotate. Hopefully you can see my mouse circling the lighter white area on this image, just showing the large amount of damage that was done there. So going back to JB, so again, he had damage in his left frontal lobe rather than the right. And he demonstrated, rather than a bias towards remembering, he showed a bias towards knowing. So he made a lot more, he went through similar sort of word learning task as BG. And he said that he knew the words rather than saying he remembered them. So he was still showing this pattern for incorrectly recognizing the words, right? He was still saying, yes, I've seen that word before, even though he hadn't. but instead of having a specific, oh yeah, I remember I saw that word and I thought of a daisy or my grandma's garden. He saw the word flower, for example, and was like, oh, I don't know how I know, but I know that I've seen that before. I know that I studied that before. And so we talk about both of these cases because they suggest to us that the two hemispheres of the brain are contributing in different ways to our sense of awareness and our sense of recall. And so in these two contrasting cases, right, we saw that BG and JB had damage in two very different areas of the brain. But it seemed like potentially the two hemispheres were contributing to sort of this difference. And so in the case of BG, his right hemisphere is what had the damage. And so that meant that his left hemisphere was intact. It was still fully functional. And so perhaps this left hemisphere being intact is what then was leading to his bias for remembering. And perhaps the left hemisphere is kind of the area that sort of oversees this remembering, or this sense of remembering, I should say. And then in comparison with JB, because his right hemisphere was still intact, maybe that's what was driving his sort of bias for knowing. And so they also, both of these studies also support the idea that our memory pathways in our brains are really widespread. So it's more than just the hippocampus that's critical to retaining and accurately retrieving information from our memory, as well as our ability to sort of monitor our knowledge, right? To be able to say, oh, I remember this specifically and this is why, versus, well, I know that, but I don't know why I know that. And so this leads us to considering a possible interaction between the points on Tolving's knowing and remembering continuum and the types of memory that we've been talking about. So semantic and episodic memory. We do see some sort of interaction here that helps us to understand memory in just a more unique and nuanced sort of way. And so Conway and colleagues in 1997, what they did is they actually had college students come and take a multiple choice test. Hopefully they were well compensated, because I'm sure not a lot of college students were too excited to take another multiple choice test for something they wouldn't get very much credit for. And so they have them come take a multiple choice test and then indicate for each answer whether they specifically remembered the answer. That is, they were able to remember the details of like when and where they learned it, whether they just knew it, right? So again, sort of this idea of the semantic memory concept of being like, well, I don't know how I know that Rome is the capital of Italy, or when I learned that, I just know it. Or that they were just honestly taking a guess, that they were just taking a shot in the dark. And so the students who scored better on this multiple choice, they also reported more instances of remembering. And so this is interesting. This also sort of checks out, right? When we were talking before about, a shorter duration of time being more connected to the sense of remembering. And then we see the opposite when participants had to come back and take the test again. I'm assuming it wasn't the exact same test. They probably switched up some questions and things like that. But there was then this opposite pattern. So when they came back after a time and took the test, those who performed better on the test reported more instances of knowing than of remembering. And so this suggested to the authors of the study that there was this sort of shift in knowledge from being episodic memory in nature or episodic material, right? So going from, I remember reading that yesterday on page 3 of my study guide, and I talked that over with one of my classmates when we were studying in the library, and shifting from that to more of a semantic sense of memory. So I don't know how I know, I just know that's the answer. So in Friday's lecture, so we talked about the two different ideas between our declarative and our non-declarative memory. And so we also talked about sort of this debate that had been going on about how these types of memory happen. And so one of the ideas in this debate is that there are two separate kinds of processes that can take place depending on the demands of the task. So if the task is requiring explicit memory to be used or requiring more implicit memory to be used. But there's going to be just this one central memory system or set of structures that's involved with the operation of both of these processes. So essentially, a memory headquarters and two different processes that are interacting with that one central memory HQ headquarters. And so this was the position that the researcher Jacobi supported as a result of his experiment. So notably his false fame studies that we talked about on Friday. However, there is a good body of evidence that supports the other notion in this debate, that there are separate brain structures that are involved in explicit and implicit memory. And so individuals who have sustained damage to the temporal lobe region, they demonstrate difficulty with their declarative or their explicit memory, but they have intact non-declarative or implicit memory. And so an example of this is the famous HM. I found this great short illustrated TED Talk that just gives us a refresher for HM's memory difficulties and also nicely demonstrates the proposal of how or which structures are involved in our declarative and our non-declarative memories. Okay. Okay, weird ad. All right, here is the video on HM.
1st, 1953. William Scoville used a hand crank and a cheap drill saw to bore into a young man's skull, cutting away vital pieces of his brain and sucking them out through a metal tube. But this wasn't a scene from a horror film or a gruesome police report. Dr. Scoville was one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of his time, and the young man was Henry Molaison, the famous patient known as HM, whose case provided amazing insights into how our brains work. As a boy, Henry had cracked his skull in an accident and soon began having seizures, blacking out, and losing control of bodily functions. After enduring years of frequent episodes and even dropping out of high school, the desperate young man had turned to Dr. Scoville, a daredevil known for risky surgeries. Partial lobotomies had been used for decades to treat mental patients, based on the notion that mental functions were strictly localized to corresponding brain areas. Having successfully used them to reduce seizures in psychotics, Scoville decided to remove HM's hippocampus, a part of the limbic system that was associated with emotion, but whose function was unknown. At first glance, the operation had succeeded. HM's seizures virtually disappeared, with no change in personality, and his IQ even improved. But there was one problem. His memory was shot. Besides losing most of his memories from the previous decade, HM was unable to form new ones, forgetting what day it was, repeating comments, and even eating multiple meals in a row. When Scoville informed another expert, Wilder Penfield, of the results, he sent a PhD student named Brenda Milner to study HM at his parents' home, where he now spent his days doing odd chores and watching classic movies for the first time, over and over. What she discovered through a series of tests and interviews didn't just contribute greatly to the study of memory, it redefined what memory even meant. One of Milner's findings shed light on the obvious fact that although HM couldn't form new memories, he still retained information long enough from moment to moment to finish a sentence or find the bathroom. When Milner gave him a random number, he managed to remember it for 15 minutes by repeating it to himself constantly. But only 5 minutes later, he forgot the test had even taken place. Neuroscientists had thought of memory as monolithic, all of it essentially the same, and stored throughout the brain. Milner's results were not only the first clue for the now familiar distinction between short-term and long-term memory, but showed that each uses different brain regions. We now know that memory formation involves several steps. After immediate sensory data is temporarily transcribed by neurons in the cortex, it travels to the hippocampus, where special proteins work to strengthen the cortical synaptic connections. If the experience was strong enough, or we recall it periodically in the first few days, the hippocampus then transfers the memory back to the cortex for permanent storage. HM's mind could form the initial impressions, but without a hippocampus to perform this memory consolidation, they eroded like messages scrawled in sand. But this was not the only memory distinction Milner found. In a now famous experiment, she asked HM to trace a third star in the narrow space between the outlines of two concentric ones, while he could only see his paper and pencil through a mirror. Like anyone else performing such an awkward task for the first time, he did horribly. But surprisingly, he improved over repeated trials, even though he had no memory of previous attempts. His unconscious motor centers remembered what the conscious mind had forgotten. What Milner had discovered was that the declarative memory of names, dates, and facts is different from the procedural memory of riding a bicycle or signing your name. And we now know that procedural memory relies more on the basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures that were intact in HM's brain. This distinction between knowing that and knowing how has underpinned all memory research since. HM died at the age of 82 after a mostly peaceful life in a nursing home. Over the years, he had been examined by more than 100 neuroscientists, making his the most studied mind in history. Upon his death, his brain was preserved and scanned before being cut into over 2,000 individual slices and photographed to form a digital map down to the level of individual neurons, all in a live broadcast watched by 400,000 people. Though HM spent most of his life forgetting things, he and his contributions to our understanding of memory will be remembered for generations to come.
So, HM is definitely a really incredible source, and his legacy continues to live on. Let me go ahead and bring my PowerPoint back up here. Okay, so the pattern of damage that that HM had sustained from the surgery gave us a sense that there are certain regions of the brain that are involved with declarative and non-declarative memory. And we also have support for the opposite pattern of difficulty when a structure called the striatum is damaged. As you saw in that video with HM, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are two areas of the brain that are really, really important for non-declarative memory. That is our procedural memory. And so the striatum is a structure that's really close to the basal ganglia, and is highly involved in our procedural memory abilities. And so when the striatum sustains damage, like I said, our procedural memory then becomes impaired. We have difficulty with that. But if there's not any accompanying damage to the temporal lobe area, then the person's declarative memory will still be intact. And so this pattern of impaired procedural, or again, AKA implicit memory, it has been demonstrated in studies where rats, they underwent neurosurgery. I imagine, I mean, it's not possible, but gosh, I wish that rat neurosurgery involved like little tiny scalpels and things like that. It didn't, because that would make things difficult, but gosh, that would be adorable. Anyway, I digress from my weird nerdy fantasy of rat neurosurgery. The striatum was damaged in these rats, and they demonstrated that they were no longer able to learn in a way that was drawing on their implicit memory. And we also saw this same pattern of non-declarative memory difficulty in individuals who have natural damage to the striatum as a result of the neurodegenerative disease of Parkinson's. And so those with Parkinson's, they have an increasingly difficult time with movement. So they start to have less and less control over movement of their body. And this is due to the loss of the neurotransmitter in the brain, dopamine. And dopamine is highly concentrated in the striatum. And so then it's this loss of dopamine that reduces the striatum's function, which then in turn negatively impacts the procedural memory ability of those with Parkinson's. And there have been neuroimaging studies on people with Parkinson's that has confirmed this decrease of function in the striatum. There have been fMRI studies as well that have found a decrease in striatal activity. So which again, a decrease in the striatum, it was associated with a decrease in implicit memory. But at the same time, there's normal activation, there's normal activity in the frontal and temporal regions of the brain, which again, we know are highly involved in declarative memory. And so there's also been additional neuroimaging evidence, interestingly enough, that have suggested, well, not only are there two different sets of brain structures that are involved with explicit and implicit memory, but there actually seems to be this sort of competition with one another. So some researchers, Paul Drack in 1999 and 2001, so they found that in their subjects that when the temporal lobe was activated, the striatum was then, the activity in the striatum went down. So it's this, if you recall from experimental psychology, this negative correlation, right? As the activity of the temporal lobe went up, the striatum activity went down. And then also vice versa, when the striatum sort of came online or was turned on, so to speak, that meant that the temporal lobe activity then went down or sort of turned off, metaphorically. And so this suggests that there can only be sort of one system online, quote unquote, at a time. And so again, not only this idea that there are separate structures involved with the explicit and implicit types of memory, but also that there might be some sort of scarcity of resources. There might be some such a high draw on the brain's energy systems that you can't have both running at the same time, sort of one or the other. So, and again, here is, this is, I think, just a nice depiction of this idea of the lower striatal activity in those with Parkinson's. So here at the top, this scan here, the more of the red and orange and yellow colors, that means that there's higher activity in that area. And the cooler colors of like green and then blue and then sort of like this dark blue purple, that means less activity. So again, you can see this difference in activation, and this is the areas here on the scan, on this fMRI, are the striatum. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap things up. So let's review, what do we know about the nature of long-term memory? So we've talked about that there are two major distinctions. So we have declarative and non-declarative memory. You'll remember that declarative memory is also called explicit or conscious memory. And this is made up of our semantic memory or our fact-based memory, as well as our episodic memory or our personal, our autobiographical memory. And then the other distinction we have is non-declarative. So again, this is also called implicit or unconscious memory, and it's made up of our procedural memory. That is our implicit memory. How we, the knowledge that we have of how to go about completing a task. And we didn't really talk about this all that much. It's kind of outside the scope of this class, but also involved in our non-declarative memory is conditioned behavior. So the example of like classical conditioning in Pavlov's dogs. That is something that also is not available to conscious memory, right? The dogs weren't consciously thinking to themselves, oh, okay, so I heard the bell sound, and the bell sound is always followed by food, and so wow, I get so excited when food's coming. But rather it's just this unconscious process that's going on. And then it's important to keep in mind that these are conceptual labels that we try to use to categorize and make sense of what memory is, but sometimes the divisions between these types of memory aren't as neat as the labels might lead us to believe. And also important to note that there's the ongoing debate about how declarative and non-declarative memory function. So again, the idea of what are the two different processes that draw on the same structures in the brain, or are there two totally different sets of structures? And so interestingly enough, the research that we've covered has suggested, well, it might be more of a happy medium of these two ideas rather than an either or kind of answer. And it seems to be more of the case that there are distinct regions of the brain that are specifically involved in declarative or non-declarative memory, but that there also might be some sort of shared neural pathways and processes for each that then allow them to function in this sort of independent way. And so it seems like it's closer to sort of a both and rather than an either or. So that's where we're going to stop for today. That is the end of our chapter. On Wednesday, we will be picking up chapter 9. See you all then. Bye.